The sky over Boise was heavy with clouds as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie orange glow over the desolate backyard. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faintest hint of desperation, as if the earth itself knew something was about to change. In the center of the neglected yard stood a German shepherd, his fur matted and dirty, his eyes wild with fear and anger. The chain that had bound him for years rattled with every forceful tug, but Shadow, as they called him, showed no sign of relenting. Welcome to the HeartForce channel, where you and I find more meaning in life through dog stories. Before we continue, please comment below and let us know where you're listening to this video. And if you have any dog stories of your own, feel free to share them with everyone. His life had been reduced to a monotonous loop of pacing, his body worn thin from years of minimal care. The sound of a distant car horn or the sudden rustle of leaves sent him into a frenzy, but nothing seemed to calm the storm within him. His bark, once a call for help, had turned into a hollow cry of abandonment. To the neighbors, he was a menace. To Sarah Matthews, the animal protection officer who had been watching him for weeks, he was a tragedy waiting to be healed. He's a ticking time bomb, the locals whispered, pointing at the chained dog, afraid to go anywhere near the house. But Sarah saw something different in his eyes. She saw a soul broken, not by instinct, but by the weight of what he had endured. With every passing day, Sarah felt the pressure mounting. The media painted Shadow as a dangerous animal, and the local authorities had started to lose patience. Parents walked their children on the opposite side of the street, and the mail carriers had begun refusing to deliver letters to the surrounding homes. The whispers of a final solution, a call for action that would end the pain for everyone, grew louder. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to give up on him. She had to try. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She called Dr. Ethan Parker, a man whose name she had heard whispered with reverence in the world of dog rehabilitation. He was known for his unorthodox methods, a man who saw beyond the scars and the violence, and into the soul of a dog. "Please," Sarah begged, "you have to help us. This dog, he's not just a menace. He's broken. He needs someone who can understand him, someone who can see him for what he really is." Ethan had spent years working with traumatized dogs. His journey started in the military, where he learned that fear was often mistaken for aggression. He had seen countless dogs with hearts full of terror, unable to trust the world around them. But the first time he had truly understood the depth of a dog's pain came when he met Rex, a Belgian Malinois whose trauma had mirrored his own. Together, they fought against the darkness of fear. And through patience and understanding, Rex became a partner unlike any other. The loss of Rex in a tragic accident had shattered Ethan's heart, but it had also solidified his purpose: to help those who had been abandoned by the world. But Shadow was different. Sarah had already warned him of the challenges. "He's completely feral," she said, her voice cracking as she relayed the warnings of the behavioral specialists who had tried and failed. "He's been isolated for so long. He can't even stand to be near people. We've tried everything." As the phone call ended, Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the case settle on his shoulders. "I'll be there tomorrow," he said softly. The next morning, Sarah met Ethan at the property. They drove through the narrow streets, heading toward the abandoned house where Shadow had been left to live a life of solitude. As they approached, the barking began, a low, guttural sound that grew louder with each step. It echoed through the empty streets, a warning of the chaos within. Ethan remained calm, his eyes narrowing as they pulled up to the house. He needed to see Shadow for himself, to understand what lay beneath the fear, the aggression, and the pain. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching on the gravel as Sarah led him toward the backyard. The scene before him made his stomach tighten. There in the center of the yard, Shadow paced in circles, his movements jerky and desperate. His eyes locked onto them as they approached, and for a moment there was silence. Shadow's ears twitched, his gaze intense and filled with a mix of fury and terror. He lunged forward, his chains straining with the force of his movements, but Ethan didn't flinch. He stood still, his presence steady. "How long has he been like this?" Ethan asked quietly, watching the dog's every movement. "At least 5 years," Sarah replied, her voice barely audible over Shadow's relentless barking. "The previous owners just left him here when they moved away. No one's ever tried to help him." Ethan's mind raced as he observed the subtle signs that Shadow wasn't just a feral animal. There was something familiar in his movements, something that spoke of training, of a time when he had been part of something more than a chained prisoner. Shadow's behavior wasn't purely instinctual. It was a sign of something deeper, something lost. "I need complete control of this situation," Ethan said, his voice firm. "No media, no interference, just you and me." As Sarah nodded, Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the German Shepherd. This was no ordinary dog. He wasn't just a threat. He was a hero, one who had lost everything. And it was Ethan's job to help him find his way back. As the day wore on, Ethan sat in the yard, a safe distance from Shadow, observing his every move. Shadow's pacing grew slower, more deliberate, as he began to process the presence of the man who had come to help him. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't try to make contact. He simply existed, letting the dog get used to his presence. Hours passed, and with each one, Shadow's behavior shifted. The frantic energy began to fade, replaced by moments of stillness, moments when Shadow seemed to watch him, curious, confused, perhaps even a little hopeful. Ethan knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time in years, Shadow was starting to show signs of trust. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue across the yard, Ethan stood up and turned to Sarah. "He's not what everyone thinks he is," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "He's not a monster. He's a soldier, a hero who lost everything. We just need to help him remember who he was." The wind blew softly, carrying the scent of rain, and for the first time in years, Shadow stopped pacing. He stood still, his eyes locked on Ethan's, as if waiting for something, for guidance, for a chance at redemption. And in that moment, it became clear that this wasn't just about saving a dangerous dog. It was about restoring a piece of himself, a piece that had been lost in the darkness of his past. The sun rose the next morning with a crispness that seemed to cut through the heaviness of the previous days. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the ground was damp from the evening storm. Ethan arrived early, his mind racing with the events of the previous day. Shadow had shown the smallest signs of progress, but Ethan knew that progress, in his world, was never linear. It was a fragile thing, one step forward, 2 steps back. And in this case, every step Shadow took would be a battle against years of fear, isolation, and trauma. As Sarah arrived, she caught a glimpse of Ethan, sitting silently by the fence, watching Shadow as the German Shepherd continued his endless circuit. The chain rattled with every movement, but Shadow had begun to pace with a new sense of purpose. The wild intensity in his eyes had softened, replaced by confusion and curiosity. "Good morning," Sarah said softly, her voice breaking the silence. Ethan didn't look at her at first. His eyes were fixed on Shadow. "Morning," he replied, his voice calm. "Watch him closely. The way he's moving, it's different. He's aware of me now, more aware than he was yesterday." Sarah glanced over at Shadow, who had halted in his pacing, his eyes fixed on Ethan. The subtle shift was unmistakable. Something had changed. The dog wasn't just reacting out of fear anymore. He was considering his options. Was this the moment they'd been waiting for? The moment when the dog would begin to trust again? But even as the hope flickered, Ethan knew that the battle was far from over. Trust wasn't a simple exchange of kindness. It was a process that had to be built one moment at a time. As they watched, Shadow made his way toward the edge of the yard, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. He stopped at the fence, just out of reach, and turned his head slightly, as if deciding whether or not to make the next move. "He's testing us," Ethan murmured, more to himself than to Sarah. "He's testing whether we'll hurt him, or if we'll keep our word." Ethan took a deep breath and stood, making sure his movements were slow and deliberate. He didn't want to startle the dog. Reaching into the cooler beside him, he pulled out a small piece of chicken. As he did, he noticed Shadow's ears flick forward. The dog's nostrils flared as he caught the scent. Ethan carefully placed the piece of chicken on the ground, just a few feet in front of him, then stepped back. He didn't speak, just stood there, waiting. For a long time, Shadow didn't move. His gaze shifted between Ethan and the food. The struggle was clear in his body language. The dog wanted to eat. The hunger was there, every inch of him aching for sustenance. But there was also the fear that had been ingrained in him over 5 long years of isolation. Shadow paced a few more laps, clearly wrestling with the choice in front of him. He wasn't just deciding whether or not to take the food. He was deciding whether or not to trust again. Every fiber of his being told him to stay away. Every moment of his past had taught him that humans were not to be trusted. They had abandoned him. They had chained him and left him to suffer alone. But there, in Ethan's quiet presence, there was something different. Minutes passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky. And then, almost imperceptibly, Shadow took a tentative step forward. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as the dog moved toward the food, but he remained still. Shadow's movements were cautious, almost hesitant, but they were real. The trust was slowly being rekindled. When the German Shepherd reached the chicken, he sniffed it, then took a small step back, as if unsure of what would happen next. Ethan didn't move. He didn't speak. He just waited, watching carefully for any signs of aggression or fear. Finally, with an almost tentative gesture, Shadow leaned down and took the food. His eyes never left Ethan's, and for the briefest of moments, their gazes locked. It wasn't just a victory for Ethan, it was a victory for Shadow. A small but powerful moment where the dog made a choice. He chose to trust. By late afternoon, Sarah and Ethan were seated on the porch, watching as Shadow continued his pacing. But this time there was something different. Shadow's movements were slower, more deliberate. He would occasionally pause, his eyes turning toward them as if considering whether to make the next move. Ethan's mind raced with the possibilities. This was only the beginning. They had made progress, but there was still so much work to do. He had to help Shadow remember who he was before the chain, before the pain. Ethan believed that healing wasn't just about overcoming trauma. It was about rediscovering one's true self. Shadow was a trained service dog, a hero who had been abandoned and forgotten. But he wasn't just a broken animal. He was a soul lost in the darkness, and it was Ethan's job to help him find his way out. Later that evening, as the last traces of daylight faded and the stars began to twinkle above the Idaho plains, Ethan spoke quietly to Sarah. Shadow's not just a victim of abuse. He's a victim of a loss of purpose, of identity. We're not just rehabilitating him. We're helping him remember who he was. We're giving him back his identity. Sarah looked at the dog, who was now sitting quietly by the fence, his head slightly cocked as he watched the world beyond the yard. "Do you think he can ever get back to what he was?" she asked softly. Ethan took a deep breath. "I believe he can. It's going to take time, but he's already starting to remember. And that's where it begins." The following morning, the air was thick with anticipation. Shadow had made progress, but Ethan knew the path ahead would not be easy. Each step forward was a victory, but every misstep, every moment of fear, had the potential to set them back. Shadow was still living in the shadows of his past, and those shadows were long and dark. It was up to Ethan to guide him, but it would take everything he had. Ethan arrived at the property before sunrise, his mind already focused on the day's work. The yard was quiet, the early morning light just beginning to filter through the trees. Shadow, however, was not still. His pacing had slowed overnight, but there was still a nervous energy about him. The chain that had bound him for so long was worn thin, and Ethan knew they didn't have much time before it gave way. The fear that gripped the dog was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it was being met with something else, a flicker of hope. Today they would try something new. Today, Ethan would test Shadow's trust further. Sarah arrived shortly after, her presence more subdued than usual. The weight of the situation was heavy on both of them. The deadline was fast approaching, and the pressure from the board to show progress was mounting. They had a week before they would be forced to make a decision. And while Ethan had seen small successes, the community's fear of Shadow still loomed large. They needed results. They needed tangible proof that Shadow was not just another dangerous dog, but a soul deserving of a second chance. "Are you ready for today?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet as she joined Ethan by the fence. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on Shadow, who was pacing again, though at a slower pace than before. "I'm ready. But today, we take a bigger step. We need to show him that the world beyond this fence isn't just a place of pain. It's a place where he can live without fear." Ethan turned to Sarah. "We're going to give him a chance to choose again, to choose trust over fear." As Ethan spoke, Shadow paused in his pacing, his head turning toward them. The dog's eyes were more focused than they had been before. He was still afraid, but there was something different now. He wasn't just reacting to the world around him with terror and aggression. He was beginning to consider it, to make choices instead of being driven by his instincts. Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped forward slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. He reached into his bag and pulled out a piece of high-value treat, a small piece of beef jerky, something that would catch Shadow's attention. He placed it on the ground, just out of reach, and then stepped back. Shadow's eyes followed his every movement, his body stiff and cautious. "Come on, Shadow," Ethan said softly, his voice low and steady. "It's safe. You can trust me." For a long moment, nothing happened. Shadow's gaze shifted between the food and Ethan, but he made no move toward it. His body trembled slightly, caught between the need for sustenance and the fear that had been embedded in him for so long. Ethan stood motionless, watching the dog's every move. He didn't want to push him. This was about choice, not force. Shadow had to make the decision himself. The clock was ticking, but Ethan knew that rushing the process would only harm their progress. After what felt like an eternity, Shadow took a small step forward. The sound of his paws on the dirt was faint, but it was a sound that spoke volumes. Ethan held his breath, waiting. The German shepherd's eyes were fixed on the food, but there was no immediate rush. This wasn't the desperate behavior Ethan had seen before. This was a moment of deliberation. And then, with a final glance at Ethan, Shadow took the treat. It wasn't just a victory for the dog. It was a victory for both of them. For the first time, Shadow had made a choice. He had chosen to trust again, to step beyond the walls of his trauma, and accept that the world could offer him something other than pain. "Look at that," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He did it." Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He's remembering who he was. The rest of the day passed in a quiet rhythm. Shadow continued to pace, but there was a subtle change in the way he moved. His steps were slower, more deliberate, and when he paused to observe Ethan, there was a flicker of something more than just fear. There was curiosity. There was hope. As the evening sun cast long shadows across the yard, Sarah spoke again. "Ethan, do you really think he can get back to what he was? I mean, before all this, before the chain, before the abandonment." Ethan didn't answer right away. He had to think about the question. Could Shadow ever return to the dog he had been before the world turned on him? Could he ever fully heal from the years of trauma and loss? But as he watched Shadow, who had now stopped pacing and was sitting quietly by the fence, Ethan knew the answer. "I think he can," he said softly, "but it won't be easy. It's not about going back to who he was. It's about moving forward. It's about finding a new purpose." Shadow, as if understanding, turned his head and met Ethan's gaze. For a moment, there was no fear. There was only a dog who had endured unimaginable pain, but was still fighting to trust again, to be part of something greater than the isolation he had known for so long. The next few days felt like a delicate dance between progress and setbacks. Every morning, Shadow would greet Ethan with a mixture of hope and hesitation. The dog's once frantic pacing had been replaced with slower, more measured steps. But while the outward signs of aggression had decreased, the deep, invisible wounds still ran deep within him. Ethan knew that healing wasn't just about removing the physical chains. It was about untangling the emotional knots that bound Shadow to his past. Ethan had spent years working with traumatized animals, but Shadow was different. The German Shepherd had been trained to save lives, to be a hero in moments of crisis. And in that sense, he had once been unstoppable. But what happens to a hero when everything they've fought for is taken away? What happens when the bond with the person they trusted most is broken? Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a soldier who had lost his sense of purpose, a warrior who had watched his partner die in a tragic accident. It was no wonder that his recovery was so slow, so fraught with tension. Each day, Ethan worked with Shadow, focusing not on obedience but on trust. His methods were unconventional, often criticized by others who believed in quick fixes and rigid protocols. But Ethan had learned that trauma wasn't something that could be simply erased. It had to be understood, embraced, and slowly untangled. On the fourth day of Shadow's rehabilitation, Ethan arrived at the yard with a quiet sense of determination. The previous days had shown signs of progress, but today felt different. Today, Ethan was going to push Shadow further. They had to move beyond just survival. Shadow needed to reconnect with the world he had lost. He needed to remember that not all humans were his enemy, and not all places were prisons. Sarah met him at the gate, her face a mixture of hope and concern. "How's he doing today?" she asked, her voice soft as she watched Shadow pacing near the edge of the yard. Ethan studied the dog for a moment before answering. "Better," he said, though his tone was cautious. "But today we're going to test him. He's made progress, but he needs to know that he can trust again, not just with me, but with the world." As they entered the yard, Shadow's head turned toward them, his eyes flickering between caution and curiosity. He wasn't as reactive as he had been the first day. The barking, the growling, the frantic lunging, all of that had stopped, replaced with a quiet wariness. Ethan motioned to Sarah to keep her distance. "I'm going to try something different today. I need to see how far he's come. I need to see if he's ready to make that final leap." Ethan slowly walked toward Shadow, his movements deliberate and calm. He didn't speak at first, letting Shadow observe him. The dog's eyes tracked every step, his body tense but not aggressive. Ethan paused, just out of reach, allowing the dog to decide whether to approach or retreat. This was the test. The choice was entirely Shadow's. For what felt like an eternity, Shadow stood still, his gaze flickering between Ethan and the ground. The tension in the air was palpable, and Sarah watched with bated breath. This wasn't just about food or shelter or safety. This was about trust. Then, slowly, without warning, Shadow took a cautious step forward. It wasn't a dramatic move. It wasn't a leap of joy or excitement, but it was a step, one small, deliberate step toward Ethan. And that was everything. Shadow had chosen to engage, to trust again, in his own time, on his own terms. Ethan exhaled slowly, relief flooding through him. He extended his hand, palm up, just as he had done in their earlier sessions. Shadow hesitated for a moment before moving closer. The dog's body language was still cautious, but there was a shift, a subtle change in how he carried himself. He wasn't just protecting himself from the world anymore. He was engaging with it, choosing to step out of his circle of isolation and into the possibility of connection. When Shadow finally reached Ethan's hand, the moment felt like a breakthrough. The dog sniffed it carefully, then nudged it gently with his nose. It wasn't just a gesture of trust. It was a moment of reconciliation, of Shadow reclaiming a piece of himself he had long buried under layers of fear and grief. "Look at him," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He's really doing it." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He's remembering who he was. And more importantly, he's remembering who he can still be. As the days passed, Shadow's progress continued, but it was clear that healing wasn't going to be quick or simple. The scars of his past still haunted him, especially when certain triggers, loud noises, sudden movements, reminded him of the trauma he had endured. But with each day, Shadow became more comfortable with the idea of trust. He allowed Ethan to get closer. He began to follow his commands, slowly but surely. It wasn't just about the physical rehabilitation. It wasn't just about getting the dog to sit, stay, or heal. It was about restoring his spirit, his will to trust, and his sense of purpose. Shadow had been a hero before, part of a search and rescue team that saved lives in the wilderness. But somewhere along the way, he had lost everything. And now, with Ethan's guidance, he was beginning to reclaim that part of himself. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of pink and orange, Sarah and Ethan stood together at the edge of the yard, watching as Shadow trotted confidently across the field. The change was more than just physical. There was a new energy about him, a sense of focus, of purpose. He was moving with the kind of discipline that had once defined him as a search and rescue dog. "Do you think he'll ever go back to what he was?" Sarah asked softly, her voice filled with both hope and uncertainty. Ethan turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "Not exactly. He's different now. But in a way, I think he's become even stronger. He's facing his past, not running from it. And that's something a lot of people and dogs never learn to do." As the light faded, casting long shadows over the yard, Sarah smiled. "He's come so far." Ethan nodded, watching as Shadow stood still, his head held high, his gaze focused on the horizon. "We all have our battles," he said quietly. "But as long as we keep choosing trust over fear, we keep moving forward. And that's all we can do." The days had grown colder, and the once vibrant leaves of autumn had begun to fall, carpeting the ground in shades of gold and crimson. But within the walls of the yard, something extraordinary was happening. Shadow had come so far. The dog who had once been a broken, feral animal, chained to a life of despair, had found a spark of light within himself. He was no longer the unpredictable, dangerous dog the world had once feared. He was beginning to remember who he was: a skilled, confident, an intelligent dog, a hero in his own right. Ethan stood at the edge of the yard, watching Shadow as he walked with purpose, his movements fluid and focused. The progress had been nothing short of miraculous. But Ethan knew they weren't done yet. There was one final test, one that would determine not just Shadow's future, but his place in the world again. "Today's the day," Ethan said quietly to Sarah, who had joined him by the fence. "We've worked hard to get here, but now we need to show the world what Shadow can do." The pressure was on. The deadline was drawing near. The board of directors at the Animal Protection Department was anxiously awaiting tangible proof that Shadow could be rehabilitated. They had seen the videos, heard the reports, but they needed more. They needed to know that Shadow could be trusted, not just by Ethan, but by others. The community, the media, and even the board itself needed to see him as something more than a relic of his past. They needed to see him as a hero once again. Ethan had planned this final test meticulously. He wasn't going to rely on food or simple commands anymore. Shadow needed to prove to himself and to the world that he was still capable of his former purpose. It was time for a real-world test, a demonstration of his skills as a search and rescue dog. As the morning sun rose, the yard was filled with a sense of urgency. The equipment was set up, scent markers, obstacles, and a series of challenges designed to simulate the kind of search and rescue scenarios Shadow had once excelled at. Sarah stood by, her camera ready, prepared to document every moment. This was their last shot. The stakes couldn't be higher. Shadow, for his part, was calm but alert. His eyes were focused, his body language steady. There was no hesitation in his steps as he moved through the yard, sniffing the air, pausing to check every scent marker with practiced precision. He was in his element. His previous trauma seemed to fade as the scent of the environment filled his senses, igniting the trained professional within him. Ethan watched intently, ready to guide him when necessary, but hoping to see Shadow's instincts take over. He had seen the signs of the dog's old training. He recognized them in the way Shadow approached the scent markers, the way his movements became deliberate and calculated. This was the dog who had once saved lives, who had worked side by side with his handler to rescue people from life-threatening situations. And now, that dog was coming back to life. As they moved through the yard, Shadow's confidence grew. He navigated the obstacles with ease, weaving between barrels and jumping over small barriers. Every move was precise, controlled, and calm. His body language radiated a quiet strength, a strength that had been buried under layers of fear for so long. And then the moment came. A new challenge was presented, a simulated rescue operation. A missing person had been placed in a difficult-to-reach location. Shadow would have to track the scent and find the person, just as he had done countless times before. Ethan stepped back, letting the dog take the lead. Shadow's nose hit the ground immediately, his tail held high as he began to work. Ethan's heart raced as he watched. This wasn't just about the rescue. It was about proving to Shadow that he still had purpose, that he was still a hero. The seconds stretched into minutes as Shadow moved through the yard, methodically sniffing each scent marker, moving toward the target. His movements were precise, calculated. He wasn't just working for the treat, for the reward. He was working because it was what he was born to do. Finally, Shadow found the missing person, hidden beneath a pile of leaves. He alerted with a bark, signaling that he had made the discovery. Ethan rushed forward, smiling as he reached the target. Shadow stood proudly beside him, his posture tall, his eyes bright with the realization that he had done it. He had found the person, just as he had found countless others in the past. The transformation was complete. Ethan knelt beside him, placing a hand on Shadow's head. "You did it," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You found your way back." As the day wore on, the evaluations began. The board members from the Animal Protection Department arrived, along with other officials, to observe Shadow's progress. The tension was palpable. Ethan stood by, confident in the work they had done, but aware of the challenges that still lay ahead. The board watched closely as Shadow demonstrated his abilities. They saw a dog who was calm, controlled, and focused. A dog who had come a long way from the broken creature they had initially seen. The demonstration of his search and rescue skills was enough to convince them that Shadow was more than just a rehabilitated dog. He was a professional. He was a hero. The final evaluation was intense. Dr. Richard Morton, one of the board members, stood up to address Ethan. "You've done something remarkable here, Dr. Parker," he said, his tone begrudgingly admiring. "Shadow's progress is undeniable, but there are still concerns. The community has been fearful, and the pressure to follow protocols is immense." Ethan nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I understand the concerns, but Shadow has already proven something far more important. He's proven that he can trust again, and he's shown us all that the capacity for healing is far greater than we thought." The room fell silent as the committee deliberated. Finally, Margaret Reynolds, the head of the board, spoke. "Dr. Parker, after reviewing Shadow's progress, and after seeing firsthand the transformation he's undergone, I believe we can all agree that he is ready. Ready for what he was always meant to do." Ethan's heart swelled with pride as Margaret turned to Shadow, who was sitting calmly by his side. "Shadow," she said softly, "you've earned your place in the world again, not as a dangerous animal, but as the hero you've always been." The official paperwork was signed, the formalities concluded. Shadow had passed the evaluation. He was reinstated as a service dog. But more than that, he had reclaimed his identity, his purpose, and his dignity. And for Ethan, there was no greater victory than seeing the once broken dog stand tall again, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the day ended and the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah looked over at Ethan, who was standing beside Shadow. The German Shepherd was calm, poised, and alert, exactly what he had been trained to be. He had come full circle. "He's not just back," Sarah said quietly. "He's better than he was before." Ethan smiled, his eyes fixed on the dog who had become so much more than a case, than a project. "Yes," he said softly, "he is." The journey that Ethan and Shadow shared is one that transcends the rehabilitation of a traumatized dog. It is a testament to the resilience of the canine spirit, the power of trust, and the importance of giving someone or something a second chance. Shadow's story is not just about overcoming trauma. It's about rediscovering purpose, remembering who we truly are, and taking the steps to heal from the pain that binds us. The lesson here is clear. Healing is not linear. It takes time, patience, and above all, the willingness to trust again. Shadow's journey is a reminder that no matter how far we've fallen, there is always a way back. What do you think of Shadow's incredible transformation? How has his journey touched you? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the HeartForce channel for more inspiring stories that remind us all of the strength and resilience that lives within us.